Part 1. The morning sun hit the tall windows of the mansion, but inside everything felt cold. Richard stood in his home office, staring at the pile of papers on his desk without really seeing them. At 52 years old, he'd built a technology company worth millions, but lately, nothing seemed to matter much. His eyes drifted to the window overlooking what used to be his wife's pride and joy, the garden. Now it looked like a jungle. Weeds choked the flower beds. The hedges had grown wild and shapeless. Rose bushes that once bloomed in perfect rows now sprawled in every direction, their petals brown and dying. He'd been meaning to hire someone to fix it for months, maybe even a year. Time had a funny way of slipping past him these days. 2 years. That's how long it had been since Catherine died. The cancer took her quickly in the end, though the fight had been long. And in those 2 years, Richard had watched his whole world shrink down to just work and worry. Mostly worry about his daughter. Lily was 16 now, and she barely spoke to him anymore. She used to be so full of life, always laughing, always busy with friends and activities. Now she just stayed in her room with the door closed. He'd hear her moving around in there sometimes, but when he knocked, she'd say she was fine and didn't need anything. The counselor said to give her time. That grief looks different for everyone, especially teenagers. But watching his daughter fade away behind that closed door was killing him in a way that felt different from losing Catherine, but just as painful. Richard grabbed his car keys. He couldn't look at that dead garden anymore today. He needed to drive, to clear his head, to be anywhere but in this house full of ghosts. The city streets were busy with the usual morning rush. Richard drove without any real destination, just letting the car take him wherever the lights and traffic allowed. He ended up in the older part of town, near the botanical gardens. Catherine used to bring Lily here when she was little. They'd spend whole Saturday afternoons walking the trails, Catherine teaching their daughter the names of every flower and plant. He parked near the entrance, thinking maybe he'd walk through, remember better times. But as he got out of the car, he noticed someone on a bench near the garden gates. A woman, maybe in her late 30s or early 40s, was curled up under a thin blanket that had seen better days. Her clothes were worn and dirty, and a backpack that looked ready to fall apart sat on the ground beside the bench. Richard had seen homeless people before. The city was full of them. Usually he'd donate to shelters and organizations that helped, made himself feel like he was doing his part, then moved on with his day. But something made him pause this time. The woman wasn't just sleeping. She'd arranged a collection of empty glass bottles around her bench, and in each one she'd placed wildflowers, daisies, dandelions, some purple flowers he didn't know the name of. Someone sleeping on a bench with nothing to their name had still found a way to create something beautiful. As Richard stood there watching, the woman stirred and opened her eyes. She sat up quickly, defensive, probably used to being told to move along. Her face was weathered and tired, with lines that spoke of hard years, but her eyes were clear and direct. She looked at him without saying anything, waiting. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you," Richard said. He should have walked away then. He had no business bothering this woman. But those flowers in the bottles kept catching his eye. "Did you arrange those?" The woman glanced at her makeshift garden and nodded. "Makes the spot feel less temporary," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse but educated. This was someone who'd had a different life once. "They're nice," Richard said, and meant it. Then before he could talk himself out of it, he added, "Do you know much about gardening?" The woman looked at him suspiciously, probably wondering if this was some kind of trick or trap. "I used to work at a nursery," she said carefully. "A long time ago. Why?" Richard surprised himself with what came out of his mouth next. "My garden's a disaster. My wife used to take care of it, but she passed away, and now it's just overgrown. I need someone to fix it. Would you be interested in the job?" The woman stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "You're offering me work? Just like that? You don't know anything about me." "You're right, I don't," Richard admitted. "But I know you care enough to put flowers in bottles when you've got nothing. And I know I need help. The job comes with a small cottage on the property where you could stay. 3 meals a day, fair pay. If you're interested." He watched her process this, saw the hope and doubt fighting each other on her face. People probably made promises to her all the time that never came through. "What's the catch?" she asked. "No catch. I've got 8 acres of gardens that need work, and you need work. Seems simple to me." The woman was quiet for a long moment, studying his face like she was trying to read whether he was crazy or genuine or both. Finally, she stood up, gathering her blanket and backpack. She was shorter than he expected, maybe 5'4", but she held herself straight despite everything. "My name's Grace," she said, extending a hand that was calloused and dirt-stained but steady. "Richard." He shook her hand. "Can you start today?" Grace laughed, but it came out more like a cough. "I don't exactly have a packed schedule." The drive back to his estate was quiet. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her backpack on her lap, looking out the window like she couldn't quite believe this was happening. Richard felt the same way. He'd made billion-dollar business decisions with less thought than he'd just put into hiring a stranger off a park bench. When they pulled through the gates of his property, he saw Grace's eyes widen. The mansion sat at the end of a long driveway lined with oak trees. Even with the gardens in disarray, it was clearly an expensive place. "You weren't kidding about 8 acres, Grace said softly. Richard led her around the side of the house to the small cottage that sat near the garden sheds. It had been built for staff years ago but hadn't been used in forever. Inside it was dusty but intact. A bedroom, small bathroom, tiny kitchen, living area. Basic but private. "It'll need cleaning," Richard said, suddenly embarrassed by how he was asking this woman to live. "I can have someone come." "It's perfect," Grace interrupted, and he could hear the emotion in her voice. "It's more than perfect." He left her to settle in and went back to the main house. As he walked through the front door, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in months: Lily's bedroom door opening. His daughter appeared at the top of the stairs looking confused. "Dad? Who was that woman?" Richard felt a small spark of something he'd almost forgotten. His daughter was actually talking to him, actually curious about something happening outside her room. "That's Grace. I hired her to work on the garden." Lily came down a few steps, peering out the window toward where Grace was standing in the overgrown yard, just looking around at all the work ahead of her. "She's going to fix Mom's garden?" There was something fragile in Lily's voice, something that could break if he said the wrong thing. "She's going to try," Richard said carefully. "I thought it was time." Lily didn't respond, just watched Grace for another moment before disappearing back into her room. But she didn't close the door all the way this time, and Richard decided to count that as progress. He went to his office and tried to work, but found himself watching out the window instead. Grace had found the garden shed and was sorting through old tools, testing which ones still worked. Even from this distance, he could see she knew what she was doing. By evening, Grace had cleared a small section near the fountain, pulling weeds and trimming back the worst of the overgrowth. It wasn't much, just a tiny patch of order in all that chaos, but it was something. Richard had food delivered to her cottage. He'd told the cook to prepare extra at dinner, and watched as Grace sat on the small porch, eating slowly, looking out at the garden like she was planning her next move. As darkness fell, Richard stood at his window and wondered what he'd actually done today. He'd hired a complete stranger, someone with no references and a backpack full of her entire life. It could be a huge mistake. She could rob him blind and disappear in the night. But somehow, seeing those flowers in bottles had told him something important. It told him that Grace was someone who still looked for beauty, still tried to create it, even when everything else had fallen apart. And maybe, he thought, that was exactly what his broken family needed. He just didn't know yet how right and how complicated that decision would turn out to be. Part 2. Grace woke before dawn in the cottage, still not quite believing she was sleeping in an actual bed. For the past 8 months, she'd been moving between shelters, park benches, and occasionally the back seat of an abandoned car near the industrial district. The sheets were clean. The room was warm. There was a door she could lock. These simple things felt like miracles. She lay there for a few minutes, afraid that if she moved, she'd wake up and find it had all been a dream. But the ceiling stayed solid above her, and through the window, she could see the first light touching the tops of the oak trees. Time to earn this second chance. She dressed in the same worn clothes from yesterday, they were all she had, and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and damp, perfect for working. Grace walked into the garden with the same feeling she used to get entering a cathedral. This was sacred ground, just neglected. She could feel it. The garden was bigger than she'd realized yesterday. Paths wound through different sections, all of them buried under weeds now. There was a rose garden that must have been spectacular once. A section that looked designed for herbs and vegetables. A meditation area with stone benches around a dry fountain. And everywhere, plants fighting to survive or already lost to the chaos. Grace spent that first full day just walking, observing, making mental notes. You couldn't fix a garden like this by just attacking it randomly. You had to understand it first, see what it wanted to be. By the third day, she'd developed a plan and started executing it. She began with the area closest to the main house, the part that was most visible from the windows. The weeds came out in armfuls. She pruned back the dead wood from bushes that still had life in them. She cleared the paths so they looked like paths again. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done since losing everything. Her hands blistered, then calloused over. Her back ached every night. But Grace welcomed the pain. It meant she was doing something real, something that mattered, and it kept her mind busy, which was important. When her mind wasn't busy, it wandered to places she didn't want to go. She didn't see much of Richard that first week. He'd leave early for his office in the city and come back late, usually after dark. A housekeeper named Patricia brought meals to the cottage. Good food, more than Grace could eat. Patricia was kind but curious. Full of questions, Grace learned to deflect with smiles and subject changes. But Grace saw the daughter, Lily. The girl would stand at her window sometimes, looking down at the garden where Grace worked. Grace pretended not to notice at first, just kept doing her job. She understood grief, understood the way it could hollow you out and make the world feel colorless. She could see it in the way Lily held herself, in the careful blankness of her face. On the 8th day, Grace was working near the herb garden when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up to find Lily standing a few yards away, wearing an oversized sweatshirt despite the warm afternoon. "Hi," Grace said, keeping her voice casual, not making a big deal of this first contact. "Hi." Lily twisted the hem of her sweatshirt in her hands. "What are you planting there?" Grace looked down at the small plant she'd been setting into the cleared bed. Lavender. It was already here, but choked out by everything else. "I'm giving it room to breathe again." Lily came a bit closer, peering at the silvery green plants. "My mom loved lavender. She used to make sachets with it for my dresser drawers. Smart woman. It's good for helping you sleep, calming anxiety." Grace went back to her work, giving Lily the choice to stay or go without pressure. The girl stayed. She sat down on the edge of a raised bed and just watched Grace work. Neither of them talked for a while, and that was fine. Sometimes silence was better than words. "The garden looks different," Lily finally said. "Better, I mean. Not like it used to, but less sad." "It'll take time," Grace said, tamping soil around another lavender plant. "Gardens don't come back overnight. They need patience. But they want to come back. That's the thing about plants. They're always reaching for the light, always trying to grow. You just have to give them a chance." She wasn't sure if Lily caught the metaphor or not. The girl didn't respond, just sat there a while longer before heading back to the house. But the next day she came back, and the day after that. Grace learned to time her work so she was doing something interesting or educational when Lily appeared. She'd talk about what she was doing, why she was doing it, what the plants needed. She never pushed, never asked Lily personal questions, never treated her like someone broken who needed fixing. Instead, Grace told stories. She talked about how roses need to be cut back hard to bloom their best, how that's where the saying pruning back comes from. She explained how some seeds need to go through cold and darkness before they can germinate, that the struggle is part of what makes them strong. She showed Lily how to tell if soil was too acidic or alkaline, how to read what plants were trying to tell you by their leaves and stems. And slowly, so slowly Grace almost didn't notice it happening, Lily started opening up. She'd mentioned something her mom used to do in the garden. She'd ask if they could plant something specific, usually something she associated with Catherine. She'd spend whole afternoons working alongside Grace, getting dirt under her fingernails. Her hair pulled back in a ponytail just like her mother used to wear it. Richard noticed. Grace would catch him watching from his office window, and the expression on his face was complicated. Gratitude mixed with something that looked like pain. Probably hurt that his daughter would open up to a stranger but not to him. Grace understood that too. Sometimes it was easier to talk to someone who didn't have expectations, who didn't need you to be anything in particular. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into the job, Grace was teaching Lily about companion planting, how certain plants help each other grow. They were putting in tomatoes and basil together in the vegetable garden that Grace had brought back from the dead. "Why do they help each other?" Lily asked, patting soil around a basil plant. Lots of reasons. The basil keeps pests away from the tomatoes. The tomatoes provide shade for the basil during the hottest part of the day. They both take different things from the soil, so they're not competing for the same nutrients. They're better together than separate. Like people, Lily said quietly. Yeah, like people. Grace glanced at the girl, saw her struggling with something she wanted to say. Grace? Lily's voice was small. Do you think people can grow back? After something bad happens? Grace set down her trowel and really looked at Lily. I think people are a lot like gardens. When something traumatic happens, it's like a hard frost or a bad drought. Everything seems to die back, and for a while maybe it looks like nothing will ever grow there again. She gestured around at the garden, taking shape around them. But the roots are still there underground, waiting. Given time and care in the right conditions, things come back. Maybe not exactly the same as before, but alive. Growing. Sometimes even stronger. Lily's eyes were shiny with tears she was trying not to let fall. I miss her so much. And I feel like if I let myself be happy again, even just a little bit, I'm forgetting her or something. Like being sad is the only way to show I still love her. Grace's heart cracked. She knew exactly that feeling, though for different reasons she couldn't explain. Your mom wouldn't want you to stay sad forever, Grace said gently. From everything you've told me about her, she sounds like someone who loved seeing things bloom and grow. Including you. Especially you. Letting yourself heal and be happy again isn't forgetting her. It's honoring the life she wanted you to have. Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her dirt-covered hand, leaving muddy streaks on her face. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She hugged Grace quick and fierce before pulling away and going back to planting like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Grace felt it in her chest, a warmth and terror all mixed together. She was getting attached to this girl, to this place. That was dangerous. Because she was living a lie and lies eventually came out. That night, Grace made a mistake. It was late, past midnight, and she couldn't sleep. The pull was too strong. She left the cottage and crossed the dark lawn to the main house. She'd watched Richard's patterns for weeks now. He always locked the front door, but there was a side entrance near his office that he sometimes forgot. Tonight he'd forgotten. Grace slipped inside, her heart pounding. She shouldn't be doing this. She could lose everything if she got caught. But she needed to be close to the truth, even if she couldn't claim it yet. She made her way to Richard's office. In the moonlight coming through the window, she could see the large mahogany desk, the bookshelves, the expensive artwork on the walls. And on the desk, in silver frames, the family photos. Grace approached them like they might shatter at her breath. There was Catherine, beautiful and smiling at various ages and stages. Wedding photos, Lily as a baby, family trips to beaches and mountains, a whole life documented in silver frames. Grace picked up one particular photo, Catherine at what looked like a garden party, wearing a sundress covered in flowers, her head thrown back in laughter. She looked so alive, so full of joy. Tears slid down Grace's face as she stared at the woman she'd traveled across 2 states to find, only to arrive too late. This was her mother. These were the years she'd missed. This was the life she'd been born into but never got to be part of. She didn't hear Richard enter until he spoke. Grace, what are you doing in here? She spun around, nearly dropping the frame. Richard stood in the doorway in his pajamas, looking confused and worried. Grace's mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation that wouldn't reveal everything. I'm sorry, she stammered, setting the photo down carefully. I couldn't sleep and I saw the light and I'm sorry. I'll go. But Richard was looking at her strangely now, really looking at her in a way he hadn't before. In the moonlight, with tears on her face, standing next to Catherine's photos. Something was clicking in his mind. Wait, he said slowly. Don't go. I think we need to talk. Grace felt everything inside her go cold and hot at the same time. This was it. The moment where everything came crashing down or finally came to death. After all these weeks of pretending, of being close but separate, of loving this family from the shadows, the truth was about to come out. And she had no idea if that truth would save her or destroy everything. Part 3. Richard flipped on the office light, and both of them blinked in the sudden brightness. Grace stood frozen by his desk, looking like she might bolt at any second. He could see her calculating the distance to the door, weighing her options. Please don't run, Richard said, trying to keep his voice calm even though his mind was racing. Just sit down. Let's talk. Grace didn't move toward the chairs. Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. I should go back to the cottage. I'm sorry for coming in here. It won't happen again. This isn't the first time, though, is it? The question hung in the air between them. Grace's face went pale, confirming what Richard had suspected. Over the past few weeks, small things had been off. A book moved on his shelf. The photo frames turned slightly different angles. At first he'd thought Patricia was cleaning differently, but the housekeeper swore she hadn't touched his office. How long have you been coming in here? Richard asked, not angry, just confused and increasingly suspicious. Grace looked at the floor. A few times. Late at night. I never touched anything valuable, I swear. I never took anything. I needed to see the photos. Why? Because I'm trying to understand something I'll never get the chance to know firsthand. Her voice cracked. Because I arrived too late and pictures are all I have left. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about? Too late for what? Grace finally looked up at him, and in her face Richard saw something that made his breath catch. There was something familiar in the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw. How had he not noticed before? I've been lying to you, Grace said, the words tumbling out now like she couldn't stop them. Not about being homeless, that was true. Not about knowing how to garden, that's true too. But about why I was at those botanical gardens specifically. About why I took this job. About who I am. Then who are you? Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a battered photograph, so worn it was almost falling apart. She handed it to Richard with shaking hands. The photo showed Catherine, but not the Catherine Richard had known. This Catherine was maybe 18 years old, her face younger and fuller, her style dated to decades ago. She was standing next to a much older couple, her arm around a little girl who looked about 4 years old. The little girl had Catherine's eyes. That's me, Grace said, pointing to the child in the photo. That's my mother, Catherine, when she was 18. And those are my adoptive parents, the ones who raised me. Richard felt the floor tilt under his feet. He sat down heavily in his desk chair, staring at the photo, then at Grace, then back at the photo. The resemblance was obvious now that he was looking for it. The eyes, definitely. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking. Small gestures he'd seen in Catherine 1,000 times, now reflected in this stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. You're saying you're Catherine's daughter? His voice sounded distant to his own ears. From before we met? She gave me up for adoption when she was 17. I didn't find out I was adopted until my adoptive parents died 3 years ago. I found some papers, some old letters. It took me 2 years to track down information about my birth mother. Grace's voice was flat now, like she was reading from a report. I finally found her name, found out she'd gotten married, found this address. I came here 6 months ago. 6 months? But you've only been working here for... I was living at those botanical gardens because Catherine used to write about them in her letters to my adoptive parents right after the adoption. She said they were her favorite place, where she went when she needed to feel peace. I'd been sleeping there for 2 months before you found me, trying to feel close to her somehow. And then I found out she died. Cancer 2 years ago. I was too late. Richard couldn't process this. Catherine had a daughter before they met. She'd never mentioned it, not once in 23 years of marriage. How was that possible? Why didn't she tell me? He whispered. Grace's expression softened slightly. I don't know. Maybe it hurt too much. Maybe she thought it was in the past and better left there. People keep secrets about pain sometimes, even from people they love. Especially from people they love. Richard's mind was spinning through their entire marriage, looking for signs, for clues he'd missed. Catherine had been private about her life before they met, but he'd never pushed. She'd said her teenage years were difficult, that she'd had a strained relationship with her parents who'd since passed away. He'd accepted that, respected her boundaries. You should have told me who you were when I offered you the job, Richard said, and heard the anger creeping into his voice now that the shock was wearing off. I know. You're right, but I was homeless and desperate, and you were offering me a chance to be close to her world, to understand the life she'd built. I thought maybe I'd stay a few weeks, learn what I could about her, and then leave. I didn't plan on... She gestured helplessly toward the window, toward the garden where Lily probably slept upstairs. I didn't plan on caring about you all, on falling in love with her daughter, On this becoming real, her daughter? Richard stood up abruptly. You mean your sister? Lily is your half-sister. Grace flinched like he'd struck her. I know, don't you think I know that? Do you think this has been easy? Spending every day with her, watching her grieve for our mother, knowing I could maybe help her feel less alone in that grief but not being able to tell her why I understand it so deeply. So tell her. Tell us both. Isn't that what you wanted all along? No. Grace's voice rose, then dropped back down. I wanted to know my mother. That's what I wanted. But she's gone and I can't. The next best thing was to know the family she'd built, to see what her life had been like, to understand the woman I never got to meet. But I never meant to deceive you about this for so long. I never meant for Lily to get attached to me, or for me to get attached to her. I should have told you the truth that first day. Richard paced to the window, trying to organize his thoughts. Outside, the garden Grace had been restoring looked almost magical in the moonlight. She'd done beautiful work out there. She'd brought his daughter back to life when he'd been failing at it for 2 years. And now he was finding out it was all built on a lie. How do I know any of this is true? He asked, still looking out the window. You could have made up this whole story. Found some old photo somewhere and constructed this elaborate con. I have documents, Grace said quietly. Adoption papers with Catherine's signature. Letters she wrote to my parents in those first few years. DNA test results, I had them done as part of my search. I can prove everything I'm telling you. Then why didn't you lead with that? Why the sneaking around? Because I'm a coward. Grace's voice broke. Because I spent 2 years looking for my mother, dreaming about meeting her, imagining what I'd say. And then I found out she was dead, that she'd been dead almost as long as I'd been searching, and it broke something in me. I ended up on the streets because I couldn't cope, couldn't hold my job, couldn't hold anything together. When you offered me this position, it felt like the universe was giving me something back, and I was too afraid to risk it by telling the truth. Richard turned to face her. She looked small standing there in his office in the middle of the night, her eyes red from crying. Part of him was furious at the deception. Part of him understood exactly what she'd been going through because he'd lived his own version of unbearable loss. I need to think, he said finally. I need time to process this, but I want to see those documents tomorrow. All of them, of course. Anything you want. Grace moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, every word I spoke to Lily about grief and healing and growth, all of it was true. I wasn't manipulating her. I was sharing what I'd learned from my own pain. And working in that garden, bringing it back to life, that wasn't part of some scheme. That was me trying to honor our mother in the only way I could. Our mother. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. If what Grace said was true, then Lily had a sister. His daughter had family she didn't know about. And he had to figure out what to do with this information. After Grace left, Richard sat in his office for hours just thinking. He pulled out his laptop and went through old photos, really looking at Catherine now, searching for secrets in her smile. He found his wedding album and studied her face in those pictures. She'd been so happy that day. Had she been thinking about the daughter she'd given up? Had there been moments in their marriage when she'd wanted to tell him but couldn't find the words? He thought about the last months of her life, when the cancer was winning. She'd said a lot of things during that time. Goodbye messages, life lessons for Lily, expressions of love for him. But she'd never mentioned another child. Maybe she'd been protecting that secret even then. Or maybe she'd wanted to tell him but didn't think it mattered anymore since that child was grown and gone, living their own life somewhere. Except that child had ended up here, sleeping in the cottage, working in the garden, teaching his daughter about resilience without any of them knowing the truth. The sun was starting to come up when Richard finally left his office. He needed to sleep, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. Tomorrow, or rather today now, he'd look at Grace's documents. He'd verify her story, and if it was all true, then he'd have to figure out how to tell Lily that the woman who'd helped her start healing over the past 2 months was actually her half-sister. As he climbed the stairs, he passed Lily's room. Her door was open a crack and he could see her sleeping peacefully, really sleeping in a way she hadn't in 2 years. Grace had done that. This woman who'd lied about who she was had somehow managed to give them both a gift he couldn't figure out how to give himself. The truth was complicated, Richard realized. Grace had been dishonest, but her dishonesty had brought healing. She'd deceived them, But her deception had been born from grief and loss, not malice. She was family, but family they'd never known about. She was a stranger, but a stranger who carried Catherine's genes and grief. Tomorrow he'd deal with the practical questions, the proof, the explanations, the logistics. But right now, watching his daughter sleep with a peace he'd thought she'd lost forever, Richard admitted to himself that part of him was grateful Grace had lied. Because if she'd told the truth that first day, he probably would have sent her away, too overwhelmed by the revelation to make a rational decision, and then they would have lost her before they ever really found her. Part 4. Grace sat in the cottage waiting for the sun to fully rise, knowing she wouldn't sleep. The documents were spread on the small kitchen table. Adoption papers, letters, DNA test results, everything that proved she was telling the truth. She'd kept them hidden in her backpack all these weeks, carrying her proof with her always like a talisman. Now Richard would see them, and then everything would change. Again. At 8 in the morning, there was a knock on the cottage door. Grace opened it to find Richard standing there looking like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn and tired. "Can I come in?" he asked formally, like they were strangers again. Grace stepped aside, gesturing to the table where the documents waited. Richard came in and sat down, picking up the first paper, the adoption certificate. Grace watched his face as he read, saw the moment when he registered Catherine's full maiden name there in faded type. Catherine Ann Morrison, mother's age 17. He went through everything methodically, taking his time. The letters Catherine had written to the adoptive parents in those first years were short and formal, clearly painful to write. "I hope she's healthy. Thank you for the photo. She's beautiful. I trust you're giving her a good life." Each letter a small window into Catherine's young heartbreak. The DNA results were technical, full of percentages and genetic markers, but the conclusion was clear. Grace shared significant maternal DNA with a profile that had been run through a genealogy database, connecting her to Catherine's side of the family tree. Richard spent nearly an hour going through everything, occasionally asking Grace quiet questions about dates or details. She answered truthfully, grateful that the lying was finally over, even if it meant losing everything. Finally, he set down the last document and looked at her. "It's all true. You're really her daughter. Yes, Lily has a sister. Half-sister, but yes." Richard rubbed his face with both hands. "This is insane. This whole situation is completely insane. I know. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing." His voice wasn't angry, just exhausted. "What's done is done. The question now is what we do next." Grace hadn't expected that. She'd expected to be fired, thrown out, maybe even threatened with legal action for fraud or something. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we have to tell Lily. She deserves to know the truth. But I need to figure out how to tell her in a way that doesn't destroy the progress she's made. You've helped her so much these past months. I don't want her to feel like that was all fake or manipulated." "It wasn't fake," Grace said urgently. "Everything I shared with her was real. My feelings for her are real. I believe you, I do. But she's 16 and she's fragile. And finding out that the woman she's been bonding with is actually her dead mother's secret daughter, that's a lot. It could go really well or really badly." They sat in silence for a while, both thinking. Finally, Richard said, "Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your adoptive parents. Help me understand who you are beyond this DNA connection." So Grace told him. She talked about growing up in a small town, about loving parents who never made her feel like she was anything other than their real daughter. She talked about finding out the truth after they died in a car accident, how the revelation had shaken her sense of identity. She explained the 2-year search for Catherine, the dead ends and small discoveries, the growing obsession that had cost her her job and then her apartment when she couldn't stop searching long enough to function normally. "I worked at a garden center for 10 years, Grace said. "I was good at my job, had an apartment, had friends, wasn't rich but was stable. Then my parents died and I found out I was adopted, and it was like the ground disappeared under me. Everything I thought I knew about myself got questioned. I needed to find her, needed to know where I came from. And by the time I found her address and came here, I'd lost everything else." "I'm sorry," Richard said, and meant it. "Grief can destroy you if you let it. I know that better than most. You've been handling it better than I did." "Have I?" Richard laughed bitterly. "My daughter locked herself in her room for 2 years. I buried myself in work and let our home fall apart. Neither of us was functioning until you showed up. Some stranger had to come along and fix what I couldn't fix on my own. I'm not a stranger anymore, though, Grace said carefully. Whether you want me to be or not, I'm family. That's what this means, right? Richard met her eyes. Yeah, that's exactly what it means. He left shortly after, taking the documents with him to make copies. He promised to return them, but wanted time to consult with his lawyer to make sure everything was properly verified. Grace understood. She'd dropped a bomb in his life. He needed to be thorough. For the rest of the day, Grace worked in the garden, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept expecting Richard to come back and tell her to pack her things and leave. Instead, late afternoon, Lily appeared on the path, smiling, oblivious to everything that had changed overnight. Grace, I was thinking we could plant those butterfly bushes today, the ones we talked about. Mom used to love watching the butterflies. Grace looked at the girl, her sister, and felt her heart break a little. Tomorrow or the next day, Lily would know the truth. Would she be happy, angry? Would she feel betrayed by the deception? Sure, Grace said, forcing a smile. Let's plant the butterfly bushes. They worked together as the sun moved across the sky, Lily chattering about school and friends and small normal things that made Grace ache. This might be their last afternoon together like this before everything got complicated. You okay? Lily asked, noticing Grace's quiet mood. You seem sad today. Just tired, Grace lied. Then because she couldn't help herself, she added, Lily, I want you to know that these months working here, getting to know you, they've meant everything to me. You're an amazing person. Your mom would be so proud of who you're becoming. Lily looked surprised by the sudden sentimentality. Thanks, that's really nice. She paused, then said shyly, You've helped me a lot, more than anyone else since Mom died. I think she would have liked you. Grace had to turn away so Lily wouldn't see the tears. I hope so, she whispered. That evening, Richard called Grace to the main house. She came nervously, expecting bad news. Instead, he led her to the living room where he'd set up the documents on the coffee table. My lawyer confirmed everything checks out, he said. You are who you say you are. Catherine's daughter. Lily's half-sister. Legally, you have no claim to anything. Catherine never amended her will to include you, and you were adopted, so the legal ties were severed. But morally, ethically, you're family. I don't want anything, Grace said quickly. I never wanted money or property or... I know. But I need you to understand that if we're going to tell Lily, if we're going to do this, then you have to stay. You can't drop this truth on her and then disappear. She's already lost one family member. I won't let her lose another. Grace felt hope flutter in her chest for the first time since last night. You want me to stay? I'm saying if we do this, you're all in. You're part of this family. You live here not as the gardener, but as Lily's sister. We figure out how this works together. Can you do that? Yes, God, yes. I never wanted to leave. I just thought, I know what you thought. But here's the thing I realized today after going through all these papers and thinking about Catherine and everything that's happened. You're not just some random person who showed up. You're Catherine's daughter. You're part of her that's still alive in the world. And I think maybe she'd want us to know you, even if she couldn't tell me herself when she was alive. Grace couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Richard continued. We'll tell Lily tomorrow, together. I want you there so she can see this is real, that you're not going anywhere. And then we'll figure out the rest as we go. Sound good? It sounds better than anything I could have hoped for, Grace managed. That night, Grace lay in bed in the cottage for what might be the last time. Tomorrow, after they told Lily everything would change again, she'd either be welcomed fully into this family or she'd be packing her bags. The outcome depended entirely on how a grieving 16-year-old girl reacted to finding out that her new friend was actually her half-sister. Grace pulled out the old photograph of her and Catherine, the one that had started this whole journey. Young Catherine smiled at the camera, her arm around 4-year-old Grace frozen in a moment from decades ago. Grace touched the image gently. I hope I'm doing the right thing, she whispered to the photo. I hope you'd want this for us. I hope you'd forgive me for all the lying and sneaking around. I just wanted to know you so badly, and this was the only way I could figure out how. The photo didn't answer, but Grace held it close anyway, drawing strength from the only picture she had of the two of them together. Tomorrow would determine whether she got to be part of Catherine's family for real, or whether the truth would tear apart everything she'd accidentally built here. She fell asleep still holding the photograph. dreaming of butterfly bushes and gardens and a sister who didn't yet know she had one. Part 5. The next morning, Richard asked Lily to come to his office before school. Grace was already there, sitting nervously in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. When Lily walked in and saw them both looking serious, her expression shifted to worry. "What's wrong? Is someone sick? Did something happen?" She looked between them, her teenager's instinct for trouble kicking in immediately. "No one's sick," Richard assured her. "But we do need to talk to you about something important." "Sit down, sweetheart." Lily sat in the chair next to Grace, her body tense. "You're freaking me out." "Just tell me what's going on." Richard took a breath. They'd rehearsed this conversation for hours last night, but now that the moment was here, all the careful words seemed inadequate. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," he began. "But it's true, and we have proof. It's about Grace and about your mother and about our family." Lily's eyes narrowed in confusion. "What about Mom?" Grace spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "Before your mother met your father when she was very young, 17 years old, she had a baby. She gave that baby up for adoption because she was too young to take care of a child. She never told your father about it. As far as we know, she never told anyone after the adoption was finalized." The silence in the room was deafening. Lily stared at Grace like she was speaking a foreign language. "That baby was me," Grace continued. "Catherine was my birth mother. I spent 2 years searching for her, and by the time I found her address and came here, she'd already passed away. I was too late to ever meet her." Lily stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loud against the floor. "That's insane. You're making this up. Why would you make up something like that?" Richard pulled out the folder of documents. "It's not made up, Lily. We have the adoption papers with your mother's signature. We have letters she wrote to Grace's adoptive parents. We have DNA test results. It's all real." "So what, you just hired Mom's secret daughter by coincidence?" Lily's voice was rising, panic and anger mixing together. "That's what you're trying to tell me?" "No," Grace said. "Not by coincidence. I was homeless and living near the botanical gardens because your mother used to write about them. They were special to her. Your father saw me there and offered me a job, not knowing who I was. I should have told him immediately, but I didn't. I wanted to be close to her world, to understand the life she'd built. I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry for not being honest from the start." Lily was shaking her head, backing toward the door. "This is crazy." "You're both crazy. Grace, I trusted you. I told you things. And this whole time you were lying? You were using me to what, get close to my family? To get money? No." Grace stood up too, desperate. "I never wanted money. I just wanted to know her. To know you. To understand where I came from. And yes, I lied about who I was, and that was wrong. But everything else, everything I shared with you in the garden, all those conversations, that was real. My feelings for you are real." "Your feelings?" Lily laughed, but it came out harsh and broken. "You don't even know me. You're just some stranger who manipulated her way into our house." "Lily." Richard's voice was firm. "I know this is overwhelming, but Grace is telling the truth. She is your mother's daughter. That makes her your half-sister. And whether we like how it happened or not, she's family." "She's not my family," Lily shouted. "My family is dead. My mom is dead and she left me, and I don't get to know her anymore or talk to her or ask her why she never told us about any of this." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "And now you're telling me she had this whole other daughter that she gave away, and I'm supposed to what? Just be okay with that? Be happy about it?" Grace's own tears were falling. "I'm not asking you to be happy. I'm asking you to understand that I lost her too. I never got to know her at all. You had 16 years with her. I got nothing. And I know that doesn't make the lying okay, but please try to understand why I did it. You had no right." Lily's voice broke. "You had no right to come here and pretend and lie and trick us into caring about you." "You're right," Grace said simply. "I had no right. But I did it anyway because I was desperate and grieving, and I made bad choices. If I could go back and do it differently, tell the truth from the start, I would. But I can't. All I can do is tell you the truth now and hope that eventually you might forgive me." Lily stood there crying, her whole body shaking. Richard moved to comfort her, but she stepped back, needing space. "I need to think," she said, her voice small now. "I can't. I need to be alone." She ran from the room before either of them could stop her. They heard her footsteps pounding up the stairs and then her bedroom door slamming. Grace sank back into her chair, putting her head in her hands. "That went exactly as badly as it could have." She just needs time, Richard said, though he looked worried. She's processing a lot all at once. She hates me. She's hurt and confused. That's not the same as hate. Richard sat on the edge of his desk, looking exhausted. Give her some space today. She'll come around. But Lily didn't come around that day or the next. She avoided Grace completely, leaving the house early for school and coming home late. When she was home, she stayed in her room. The garden, which had become their shared space, stood empty. Grace continued working on it alone, but the joy had gone out of it. A week passed in tense silence. Richard tried talking to Lily several times, but she shut down every conversation about Grace or Catherine or any of it. She was polite but distant, the same way she'd been for the 2 years after Catherine's death. All the progress, all the healing that had happened over the past months seemed to have evaporated overnight. Grace was losing hope. She'd stayed like Richard asked, but maybe that had been a mistake. Maybe she should pack up and leave, let this family heal without the complication of her presence. She was thinking exactly that, sitting in the cottage late one evening, when there was a knock on the door. Grace opened it to find Lily standing there in pajamas and a jacket, her eyes red from crying. "Can I come in?" Lily asked quietly. "Of course." Grace stepped aside, her heart racing. Lily came in and sat on the small couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. Grace sat in the chair across from her, waiting, not wanting to push. "I talked to my therapist," Lily finally said, "about all of this. About you." "Okay." "She said I have a right to be angry about the lying, and I am. I'm really angry about that." "I understand." "But she also said that anger doesn't have to be the only thing I feel. That it's possible to be angry at someone and still care about them. To be hurt by their choices but understand why they made them." Grace felt tears prickling her eyes but stayed quiet, letting Lily work through her thoughts. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot this week," Lily continued. "Trying to imagine her at 17, pregnant and scared and having to give up a baby. That must have been so hard for her, and she never told anyone, just carried that pain by herself all those years." She looked up at Grace. "You lost her too, in a different way than me, but you lost her. And I've been so focused on my own hurt that I didn't really think about yours." "Lily, you don't have to. Let me finish." Lily took a shaky breath. "What you did was wrong. The lying was wrong. But I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who was grieving and made a mistake. And I think," her voice broke, "I think maybe Mom would want us to know each other. Even if she couldn't tell us herself." Grace couldn't hold back the tears anymore. "I think so too." "I'm not ready to call you my sister," Lily said carefully. "Not yet. That feels too big too fast. But maybe we could start over? As people who are family but still getting to know each other?" "I would like that more than anything." Lily uncurled slightly from her defensive position. The therapist also said that sometimes families aren't just the people you're born to. Sometimes they're the people who choose to be there, and you chose to be here even though it was scary and complicated. That has to count for something. "You're very wise for 16, Grace said, smiling through her tears. "My mom taught me that," Lily said, smiling back. Then her expression turned serious again. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "The things you told me in the garden about healing and growing and plants reaching for the light. Did you mean all that? Or was it just stuff you said to manipulate me?" "I meant every word."